Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first session of Sunoikisis Digital Classics 2019 spring semester. Our semester deals mainly with text and language analysis and markup or annotation of texts in different ways, and querying, performing different types of searches for study and research purposes. We have 10 common sessions, and the class outlines with all the links, materials, and exercises are available there on the Sunoikisis Digital Classics GitHub page, so github.com SunoikisisDC. The Sunoikisis Digital Classics program is hosted by Monika Berti at the University of Leipzig. Monika is present here. And it has been running from the year 2015, I think. And this spring semester 2019 is chaired by Gabriel Bodard from Institute of Classical Studies in London, who has contributed quite a bit in organizing the Sunoikisis classes, and by me, Maria Vieros, from the University of Helsinki. So let's go straight to the topic. The topic of today's session is Epigraphic Markup, Leiden to EpiDoc. And the presenters are Gabriel Bodard, already mentioned, and Elli Mylonas from Brown University. And they can take you to the epigraphic markup world now. And I think Elli is the one who is starting. So please, Elli.
Hi there. So I'm going to I'm hearing an echo. I'm going to start presenting something which I'd like us to have a discussion over. So I'm not quite sure how that will work with this, the on-air version of our presentation. So maybe you could use the group chat to contribute. And I will start presenting now. Oh, there it is. Screen. That's fascinating. I didn't have it ready, so I will in a minute. All right, here we go. So, because this is a session on digital epigraphy, and digital epigraphy means studying, looking at, analyzing, understanding inscriptions, that is, things that are written on objects, very often on stones, one of the ways to start thinking about it and getting into the spirit of things is to look at an inscription and maybe talk about what is it that we would want to report on or describe about this inscription to other people? So now that I'm projecting, unfortunately, I can't hear what anybody is saying. So the notion of a discussion may... Oh, excuse me. Oh, people unmuting can talk. Okay, great. So let's see. What would you, maybe not Gabby, what would you consider to be salient features or important things about this inscription as you look at this picture? Anyone?
Well, the name, Emily Dickinson.
Name, yeah.
And the dates.
What is it, by the way?
The name, the
No, what are we looking at? Yeah.
It looks like a tombstone, but I find it a little confusing.
Okay, so it looks like a tombstone. It has a name and a date on it. That's important.
Oh yeah, no, it's not that confusing. So interesting design. Born December, called back May 1886.
Yeah, it looks
Maybe
like 15, I think. So Sina, you're talking a lot about what's written on this thing, this object,
Mhm.
which
Right.
makes a lot of sense because that's what we're looking at. But for example, we could look at this view of the same object. What somebody tell me what you also might want to record or transmit information about this object. Now we can see more of it.
Yep, there's some votive objects placed upon the stone.
Absolutely, there's votive objects on it. It's kind of clear that it's a gravestone now, I think. We have a better feeling for it.
Behind a fence?
It's behind a fence. So it's in an enclosure.
It has green space, green grass around it.
And here again, we can see the enclosure, and we can see that there are other gravestones around it. And you're talking about the green space in the enclosure, so I just wanted to move ahead a little and point out that we can locate it geographically. But I'm going to go back to this. Anything else that we want to look at or think about or remember or transcribe or record?
It's to me, a little bit unusual.
Okay, how?
The name is in this, semicircle.
Yeah, like that.
Yes.
Name is in a semicircle. We might want to talk about the shape of it, maybe? Or, is it fat or thin or tall or short?
Is it meant to vaguely look like a book?
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of work on that kind of, I'm sure there's a lot of work on American 19th century and so on, tombstones and the evolving styles. But it's very plain. Kind of interesting. I just noticed something on it, which is that if you go back, born is incised directly, whereas all the rest of it is in relief. So it's written in different ways. The actual technique is different. It has two different techniques on it. I hadn't noticed that before.
There's a quote in there as well, right? Called back is a cross-reference to a title of a work.
Oh, cool. Okay, there you go.
This was actually, for me, it's not only that I noticed it, I didn't even notice the born in the beginning because it was they're incised in such a different way than the other letters.
Great. So
there's also the material, which we can maybe only guess, but this is also something we would like to know about.
Yeah, we'd have to go look at it carefully. All right, so I don't want to take up too long, but we did talk about a number of the characteristics of an inscription, what it says, how is it written, where is it located on the stone, does it look like a book? Can we read it? In this case, it's pretty legible. We also talked about what the object was made out of, and what was it used for. Where is it in the enclosure and in the town? And we also, it's not written in here, but we talked about sort of the votive objects, things that have happened to it since it was put there. So that's, I'm going to just starting us thinking about when we look at an inscribed object, these are the kinds of things we might want to record and try to transmit to other people about that object. That said, I now turn it over to Gabby. And I guess to do that, I need to stop sharing, or can you take over, Gabby?
No, Mario.
I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, great.
Uh,
Cool. Sorry, no, I was just editing that slide as
oh,
that you were showing. So
we'll go back to it. You can show it, the edits.
People can look at it when it's downloadable later.
Okay, so now now I'm not sharing anymore. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I'm going to share. Hi, I'm going to talk a little bit about how people have started making standards for recording epigraphic information, in particular for encoding the textual information in epigraphy. And I'm going to talk starting way back before the digital period. I'm going to talk about how people have traditionally encoded this sort of epigraphic information using something that we now call the Leiden conventions. So going back a little bit, you can see my slides here? Yep.
Yep.
Great. So going back a little bit before this, people have been looking at ancient inscriptions for a long time. Even in antiquity, people were looking at older inscriptions and making assessments and judgments about the past and about historical information based on them. As early as the Byzantine period, people have been collecting inscriptions and recording them, especially if the inscriptions had verse on them and similar things. But certainly in the modern period, from the 18th and 19th centuries onwards, scholars have been recording inscriptions and attempting to scientifically and consistently record the information in them so that they can be consulted by historians. And various conventions started to come into play. So very often, different kinds of brackets and parentheses and so forth were used to indicate various interventions that the editors had to make into the text. And there was more or less consistency between different scholars in this area. By more or less, I mean there was no consistency at all, but there wasn't very much consistency. One scholar might use square brackets, another scholar would use parentheses, another scholar would use underlining, and things might be very different. So in 1931, it was decided that this really needed to get better. And it was actually papyrologists, not epigraphers, who came up with this proposal, but epigraphers very quickly adopted it. And at an Egyptological meeting in Leiden, papyrologists decided that they would use these conventions that I'm showing you on the slide now to record information about editorial interventions to text. So when text is underdotted, or when there are underdots with no text, that means that these letters are illegible or barely legible, ambiguous, without context, and because they're damaged or because they're poorly executed or whatever. When text is in square brackets or when there are dots in square brackets, this means that the letters are completely missing from the stone, not just illegible, but completely missing. And if restored, they're only restored by context, by comparison to other texts and so forth. Texts in these angle brackets are texts that were never actually written on the stone. So it's not that they've been lost, it's that they were never written there, but the editor believes that the scribe erroneously forgot to write them there, and so is restoring them for that reason, or not restoring them in the case of there being dots in there. Parentheses are used to mark the part of an abbreviated word which is left off the stone. So in this example, the A is written on the stone, and the BC is the expansion of that abbreviation, and so is put in parentheses because that's part that's not actually on the stone. Curly braces represent letters that are on the stone but are on the stone in error, and double square brackets represent deleted characters. So you can still see them, but some attempt has been made to erase them from the surface of the stone or the papyrus, etc. So that's just an example. There are a couple of links down there to where you can get much more detailed descriptions of the Leiden conventions. I just want to show you them in practice briefly. So here's an inscription. This is inscription number 2 from the Inscriptions of Roman Tripolitania corpus. There's a link to where you can find this whole inscription online if you want to look at it in a bit more detail, along with translation and commentary and so forth. But for our purposes, I'm just going to look at the first 5 lines. If you know the Leiden conventions, because you you're familiar with them, you studied the previous slide, you understand what's going on with the various parentheses and other marks that are in this transcription. I'm also just going to show you here a photograph of that inscription, so you can so we can look briefly at what's going on between the two. So we see, for example, that the first line, which reads Domini Caelesti, the DO at the beginning of that line are completely lost from the stone, and the editor has had to restore them, because what else could Mini Caelesti mean? It must be dot. So if we look at this, we see indeed there is the beginning of the M. The M is damaged, but it can't be anything other than an M, so it's not underdotted. And the DO would have been here where the stone has been damaged, and the rest of it is fairly legible. Similarly with the pro on the next line, the pro is missing, and there's the second word salute there, and then some more space. The final word there, imperatorum, imp is written on the stone, eratorum, imp must stand for imperatorum, and so has been expanded. And then if we look on the stone here, we see, well, we don't just see imp, we see imp with two P's, because this is the standard Latin abbreviation. When something is in the plural, you may double one of the letters, and so the addition doesn't show the two P's in there, but only shows the one that is part of the word. So that's something where Leiden has actually lost some of the information, and we'll come back to that issue later. One thing to note, I'm not going to go through everything in here, a lot of these things are the same, but one thing to note on the next line is that where on the stone we see Aureli, Antonini, etc., that there clearly isn't room for the entire name Marci Aureli, so the editor assumes that Marci was abbreviated. So we have there an abbreviation, even though we can't see it. The editor has restored this abbreviation. So we have the parentheses nested inside these square brackets in that case. And on the final line, I just want to point out, we have the same thing here. It's a little bit hard to see, but that says AUGG, and that again is Augustorum. It's the plural. So aug is the only part that is part of the word. The second G represents the pluralness of it. And the end of that line, you see on the stone that there are some traces, but I think those are from the line below. There are some traces, but not very much at all. This is almost entirely erased. So whoever took a chisel to this stone for purposes of damnatio memoriae or whatever else to remove one of the names there did a fairly good job. And so we have these double square brackets that represent erasure. And then we also have single square brackets which represent the fact that inside that erasure, we cannot see what is there, but the editor has restored it by guesswork, by philological comparison, or by historical comparison, or from some other context. So that's just a very quick overview to how we have used our knowledge of Leiden to interpret this edition and compare it to what we can see on the stone. So the point I want to make there is just that the Leiden conventions, of which this is a subset, there's various other things that Leiden suggests as well, are a markup system. They are a arbitrary, unambiguous system for recording philological and other observations about a text and about a text-bearing object, such that an expert can understand what those mean. We know what those curly braces mean. We know what those double square brackets mean, but it is completely arbitrary. It doesn't mean anything to anyone who doesn't know that. Someone who's not an epigraphist or a papyrologist or a historian looking at this edition for the first time would have no way of knowing that DO is in square brackets because it's missing from the stone. It could be in square brackets because it's in a different color. We've no way of necessarily knowing that. So it's an arbitrary system that you can only read if you have the mapping, if you have this mapping there, which has been codified, as I say, in 1931. I think I'll pass on now to Elli, who's going to talk to take this a step further and talk about how this concept of arbitrary mapping has been taken forward a step further in more recent years when we're much more thinking about the issue of digitizing and computer processing of text. I'll pass over to Elli now.
Okay, Elli, you have to unmute yourself.
Okay, I think I successfully did that.
Yeah,
And should be presenting. Is that correct? All right. So Gabby described how, for the purposes primarily of print, a markup system that was generally agreed upon and that was unambiguous insofar as it whatever it represented was clearly represented. I mean, it could be translated into understanding what the marks mean were always the same. That was very helpful and worked well in print. As epigraphy, like many other humanities disciplines, moved to digitizing and putting corpora online so that they could be searched, analyzed, and so on more easily and shared, a digital markup system that was more easily perhaps acted upon by computer programs was developed and has been pretty much adopted certainly by Greco-Roman epigraphers and increasingly by epigraphers in other disciplines and other areas. So I'm going to talk now about EpiDoc, which is this digital markup system, explain a little bit about where it came from, how it works, and then start talking about how we would mark up an inscription, which then Gabby will also talk about. So the markup system, which is used to encode and digital inscriptions, is called EpiDoc. And this is very brief, but EpiDoc is a customization. It is a special version of a markup schema developed by the Text Encoding Initiative. And so EpiDoc is designed for epigraphy. The Text Encoding Initiative is a much more broadly applicable markup schema. These terms will be explained. And it's also a set of guidelines that explain how the schema should be used. And the Text Encoding Initiative was designed by humanists for marking up literary and historical texts. And it takes advantage of a language called XML, Extensible Markup Language, which is essentially a set of rules for encoding documents so that they can be more easily processed by computers. And one reason that the epigraphers developed EpiDoc using TEI, which uses XML, is not that you couldn't theoretically write a program to parse and use the Leiden notation marks, but that XML is used across the world and in many, many areas of disciplines, primarily HTML, for example. So there's tons of software and people developing new features, new kinds of programs, new ways of using it that we can take advantage of. So XML is not only a very useful way of describing documents, but it's also got a huge base of users in the world. So this is just for information. Information about EpiDoc. EpiDoc consists of a schema, which is a set of rules, which we'll talk about in a second, and a set of guidelines. The guidelines describe in words how to use the particular parts of the schema to indicate all the things that Gabby showed you in the Leiden notation. And the TEI, which is the mother of EpiDoc, as it were, would be an authority that if EpiDoc doesn't explain something well, one would look at the TEI. It also has guidelines and a full website. And both of these schemas, these ways of marking up text, have very active user communities and listservs where questions are answered in a friendly way. So I'm going to come back to this, but I'll show you very quickly that all of the Leiden marks that Gabby showed earlier can be translated into EpiDoc using this kind of notation, about which you will know a lot more in about 6 minutes. So, question? No, somebody joined. I'll start by saying two things about XML. XML is not a language, although I did use that term before. XML is essentially a meta language. It provides components that then can be used to describe specific encoding languages. So this is just kind of a naming of names. And XML makes one very basic assumption, which is that a document is a hierarchy. There are ways around this for those who will ask, but essentially XML models documents as a set of containment relationships, as a tree, as a set of things that one can contain the other. So for example, if we take a citation, the citation can have within it pieces that indicate an author or title, and it can have a piece called an imprint, perhaps, which might have the publisher and place and date within it. So this kind of tree structure or containment structure is inherent in XML. Now I'm going to basically go through the basic building blocks of XML so that we can actually use them when we talk about EpiDoc. XML consists of things. An XML document is marked up with elements. An element surrounds text, and it has two parts, a start tag and an end tag, and content. So in my example, we have an element, the element name, which surrounds the content Valentinae, and has a start tag name, which has the name of the element inside the pointy brackets, and it has an end tag, which is the exact same thing as the start tag, whoops, but it has that slash to indicate that it's an end tag. So it's kind of, imagine parentheses. So this is an element. Elements may nest, but they may not overlap. We said that XML describes a document as a tree, as a hierarchy. So, for example, this is wrong. A line element starts here. Within it, there's a sentence element, but oh my, the line element ends. And actually another one starts, and then the sentence element ends. So we have something that looks kind of like this. This is overlap, and this does not exist in XML. It is not allowed. This is incorrect. Another way of doing it might be to do something like this, where the sentence surrounds the two line elements. There are many other ways of doing this, and if you get into more detailed XML, ink has been spilled. There's another special case of elements. If an element has no content, it can be displayed with a shorthand where instead of having the start tag and the end tag and no content, you can have a single tag, an empty element tag, which is the element name with the slash following, and not two tags. And empty elements are actually fairly important because there are things that we might want to mark in a text that aren't content but may be a position. So for example, a page break. One more thing about elements is that elements may have attributes. An attribute usually provides information either about the element or about its content, and it is attached to the start tag of an element. So our name element that we were looking at before, we might decide that it's important to say what kind of name this is. This is a person, the name of a person. So our name element might have a type attribute with the value person, which goes on the start tag. Note that it does not go on the end tag. In other words, it is not repeated. This is a common error. And it could have, an element may have more than one attribute. So for example, we could have a type attribute showing that the name belongs to a person, and then we could have a role. Now this is interesting because the type attribute sort of talks about the element. It's a name, person's name, but the role attribute actually talks about the content. So Valentina is a spouse. Attribute values, it's the thing inside the quotes in the attribute, are alphanumeric. and they shouldn't have spaces. Well, they're allowed to have spaces, but that's just playing with fire. Don't put spaces in your attribute values. And attribute values may come from a closed list, so the list could be predetermined. The type of name could be person, place, or thing. There could be a list of suggested values, or it could be anything. And there is a time when spaces appear in attribute values, and that is that some attributes are allowed to have more than one value, and those values are separated by a space, which is why it's better not to put a space in your regular attribute value. So to conclude, XML files, XML documents are marked up with elements that are nested, and this is what an element, this is the anatomy of an element. We have an element called greeting with its element name, greeting, a start tag, and an end tag with the content hello world. Our greeting element has an attribute called XML lang, whose value is en, which happens to be the ISO standard name for English. So this is pretty much what you need to know about elements. The next thing you need to know about XML is that an XML document must be well-formed. If it's not well-formed, it's not XML. And a well-formed document basically has correct syntax. All the pointy brackets, the slashes, the quotes are in the right place. The element begin tags and end tags match, unless it's an empty element. The elements nest properly, there's no overlap, and then there's what is called a root element that surrounds all other elements. This is a well-formed XML document, and it is a prerequisite for a document to even be considered XML. But XML gets much more interesting when its elements and their relationships are defined by a schema. So EpiDoc and TEI are XML schemas, which is sets of rules that tell you what elements you've got at hand and who can contain whom. So, and what attributes exist, elements can go on which elements, and what values can go on which attributes. So, a file that has XML syntax that is correct is well-formed. A file that can be validated, that's a term of art, can be validated according to a schema is a valid XML document. So EpiDoc documents are valid against the EpiDoc schema, and then they are correct EpiDoc documents. Note one thing. The name of an element and an attribute, the fact that I used name or greeting or paragraph or something like that, is useful for us who read this thing. The software does not know that P, for example, means a thing called a paragraph, which is a clump of text that notionally fits together. So we have the convention of saying P is a paragraph, and what we need to say essentially is that P is used to mark a paragraph, but our XML software does not care whether it's called P or 3 or 45 or Fred. So XML does not know that you're marking content correctly. It just knows that the relationships of its elements are correct. So looking again at our Leiden map, we see that the underdotted characters, which are unclear, they can possibly be read, but not necessarily we're not necessarily sure of them, might be surrounded by an unclear element rather than having the dots underneath them. The gap is an empty element. See, no end tag, but it has the little slash. But it's got two attributes. One, which is the reason. Why is there a gap there? Well, it was lost. It could be that it was erased, or that there was an ink blot on it, or that lichen grew over it. And we don't know how big the gap is, but if we did, we could put in how many characters the gap is, and so on and so forth. There'll be more of this in a bit. So now I'm going to talk about how we use EpiDoc. So I'm going to start this, and Gabby will take over in a minute. And what I want to, actually, before I do this, are there any questions on what we just talked about with XML and EpiDoc? No?
No, I don't think there's no.
Okay, great. I can't see the list, the string of faces because I'm sharing. So, so I guess no one is looking quizzical. All right. So now that you know everything there is to know about XML and how it works, and a little bit about how EpiDoc works, we're going to plunge right in and talk about what we're all interested in, which is how do you encode an inscription? And we'll start by talking about the structure of an EpiDoc edition. So this is a little schematic of a file. The squares are showing us the pieces of the file. And essentially, now that you know about pointy brackets and elements and element names and start tags and end tags, you can see that an EpiDoc text, an EpiDoc XML file, starts with this line here, which we don't even think about why all those pieces are there. We just put them there. And it ends with a TI element. So the TI element is the root element that surrounds the whole document. And within that TI element, we have three basic pieces. One called TI header. Notice, by the way, that T element names are case sensitive. So TI header has a capital H. It's got to have a capital H. So there's a TI header, there's a facsimile element, which I'm not giving you details about, and then there is a text element, which contains the body of the text. It contains text and commentary. The TI header contains pretty much information about where the original object, and also a little bit of information about the file itself. So what is this called, and who is the author of it, who is the editor of it, and things like that. So I'm going to focus on the TI header, the part that just gives you information about the object and about the inscription. And Gabby will then tell you about encoding the actual inscription. So can you see this? I had to squeeze a lot of stuff on. I hope so. I'll go back a second. Inside the TI header, although in the full TI and full EpiDoc, you can put lots of other bits of information. We're not going to talk about those today. We're going to talk about an element called the file desk, which contains the title statement. Notice, by the way, that this is not correct XML. I'm kind of giving you an outline by just giving you the name of the start tag. There's a title statement element which contains information about the current file. So what is the name? What is the title of our current publication? Who's responsible for it? What publication information do we want to give? For example, rights, can you use this? Is it open source? Whatever. So these first two items contain information about the file. The source desk, which we're going to talk about in more detail, contains information about the object and the text itself. So it contains information about the text itself. And it contains another element called MS desk. So source desk is inside file desk, and it has inside of it MS desk. Inside MS desk, we have we're going to focus on two major pieces of the hierarchy. Again, there are many, many more things that you could put in here. We're not going to talk about them. PhysDesk is the physical description of the object, and history is history, provenance, date, location, and so on. The physical description, the physical description has within it information about the material support. We're going to look at this in detail in a second, and also about how the text is laid out. It also may talk about the way that the letters or anything on the stone or the object is inscribed. So for example, in our Emily Dickinson gravestone, we might want to indicate that part of it is inscribed differently, but it was incised and the other parts are in relief. The second part of our MS desk is the history, which contains information about the place where the object was originally and its date, and possibly provenance information if it's been moved since then. The next part, which I'm not going to talk about in detail, is the text. This is not part of the header, but here, the third bit of a TI EpiDoc document, the text contains the edition and so on. Gabby will tell you more about that. We're going to talk about this inscription. So I'll let you look at it for a second, and then I will move to actually trying to encode some information about this inscription. Am I okay on time? Can I keep talking?
We overran earlier, so yeah.
All right. So I'm going to talk about how to encode some of the header information for the inscription we just looked at. One thing I wanted to tell you about is so the assignment that you're being given is to encode some inscriptions using Oxygen, which you've downloaded and installed. Oxygen is, unlike most software that this community espouses, this is not open source software. It is a commercial product, and we do not have access to the code. However, it is so unbelievably good at handling all sorts of aspects of XML and XML processing. It is available at a very reasonable cost, and it is written and supported by people who have really been very, very collaborative with and supportive of the digital humanities text encoding community. So we do use this commercial software. There are some open source XML editors. Mostly they're not anywhere this good, and often if they are, they're a very special case. They've been written for a particular kind of document. So we use Oxygen, and that's one thing. The second thing that I want to tell you about Oxygen is that, or many of us use Oxygen, is that when you open it for the first time, first of all, there's some kind of dialog box that you have to click to go away. It gives you news about Oxygen, but also all of these extra panes are open all around it. You'll have even more than I have here. So the first thing I do when I get into Oxygen is I close these panes so that I can actually see my text, see as much of my text as possible. Another thing that you need to know about Oxygen is that Oxygen validates. So as long as it is aware, which it is, of your schema, of the EpiDoc schema in our case, which it is because you're using the template, the epidoc template that you have downloaded. It has information about the TI, it tells you where to get the TI epidoc schema. So Oxygen handles that, and that means it can validate, which means it can tell you if you're using the elements correctly, if they're in the right order, if the containment is correct, and it can even suggest elements and help you in the editing process. As long as this little square on the right is green, it means that your document is valid. If you make a mistake, it turns red. And that means your document is no longer valid. And in this case, it's been well formed because I actually deleted an angle bracket. Now, I'm going to go a little quickly, but I'm just going to show you the pieces of a little bit about how to edit and the pieces of the header that we looked at. Here's our header. Starts here. It has a file desk, which has some information about the file, which we will not fill in. And then we get to the source desk, which contains the MS desk. It's the only thing it contains. The MS desk has an MS identifier element, which we use. And so MS desk, source desk and MS desk are talking not about the file and the transcription, but about the stone, or in our case, the stone that we just looked at the picture of. So we might want to put down information about how it's identified wherever it is held. So if it's in a museum, it might be the museum name and the inventory number. If it's a publication, it might be the number in the publication. Then we get down to the phys desk, which is where all the fun happens. The physical description, phys desk, for us humans who read these words and understand language, the physical description, not the computer, which does not know that phys desk is significant. In our case, we're only looking at a few of the phys desk elements. We're looking at the object description and the hand description. So for example, we could put down something about this stone, which I happen to have looked at, and I might want to put down that it is okay, so here's Oxygen being nice. It was an empty element, material was empty element. I got rid of that little trailing slash, and now it gave me a start tag and an M tag. I happen to know that this is made out of limestone, and I happen to know that it's a tablet. I think it's a tablet. Yeah. And actually, I might want to. So this is a limestone tablet. Did I? Oh, see, look at that. It's a mistake. A limestone tablet. And I put a space in between the two because I might like it to show up in my, when I display it with a space in between. I might also want to provide dimensions. And I could either maybe turn this into a paragraph and say with dimensions. Now, I'm going to show you one thing about oxygen because then I'm going to probably cut this short so Gabby can talk more about his about encoding the inscription. I'm going to show you a feature of oxygen. So oxygen understands the EpiDoc schema. So if I type an open angle bracket here, I'm being given the legal elements that I'm allowed to put with. I happen to want to put in height, and the height of this inscription is, I think it says 39. I can't read my own writing. 39. And I also might want to tell you 39 what? Right? 39 meters, centimeters, millimeters. So if I place my cursor inside the dimensions, start tag, and press space, I am now given a list of all the legitimate attributes. And the attribute I want, I happen to know it's called unit, so I type U, and I'm given unit, and I press return. My cursor moves to in between the quotes, which is where the attribute value goes, and I'm given my options because this is an attribute value that has recommended values, and I think this is centimeters. So I now say that my support is made out of is a limestone tablet where limestone and where material and object type are indicated with elements, and it has dimensions, height, and I could continue on to add height, depth, and width, which I'm not doing. And of course, I want to take away this etc. because it's just random helper words from our template. In the layout desk, I can talk about whether there are multiple columns and how many lines there are. In the hand desk, I can describe the heights, the sizes of the letters, and also how they're written. And finally, in the history, I might be describing where it's from and when it's from. And all of these elements have various attribute values that allow you to specify information more precisely. Gabby, I think I'm going to turn it over to you now because this is running on.
Yep, sure. I'll
Let me stop sharing.
I'll be more. I'll try and be more.
Oh no, you're doing the meat of things. So, oops.
Okay. So am I screen sharing again?
Yeah, looks like.
Yeah.
Great. So so again, this is the text that that Elli just showed you. This is the inscription that Elli just showed you. You can all, I'm sure, looking at this, you can read the text and you know exactly what it says immediately. I'm joking. I have no idea what it says from that photograph. It's a really hard to read inscription. There's a drawing of it that was made, which is slightly easier to read. But I'm going to cheat, and feel free when doing the exercise to similarly cheat. And I'm going to find an existing edition of it. This edition could be on paper, or in this case, it's online. And these are, I'm just going to take the first 5 lines or so of this to very quickly show how, again, in Oxygen, you might mark up this the text, the transcription of this text. So I'm going to go into I've just copied those first 5 lines, and I'm going to paste them in there and then start marking them up. I'm going to keep this photograph in the background so we can flick back to it occasionally if we want to actually see what's going on in the text there. So here we have the same XML file that that Elli showed you, the template, the EpiDoc template, and I'm going to ignore everything in the header that she's been showing you, and I'm going to look just at this div type equals edition. This is where the edition goes, the transcription goes. And so I'm going to delete the filler text from the template. I'm going to keep this AB element, which contains an anonymous block of text. And I'm going to keep the LB element, which is one of these empty elements that Elli showed you earlier, which is the line beginning in EpiDoc. And again, if you hover over this, Oxygen will tell you that. They'll tell you that's a line beginning, which marks the start of each line of the transcribed text, including the first. And it has an N, meaning number 1, line number 1. In this case, so I'm going to paste in those 5 lines of text that I copied from that web page, and I've pasted it in with all the Leiden in there that you see. And so if you think of EpiDoc as translating Leiden from a typographic convention to an XML representation of the same semantics, but using a different typography, I'm going to replace every one of these human readable typographic symbols, the square brackets, the parentheses, the curly braces, the hyphens, the line numbers, all of these things, and I'm going to replace them with machine readable XML information. If you are looking at the exercise, you will have access to the quick reference documents, which will show you a lot of these parallels that between Leiden and EpiDoc, and you'll be able to do the same thing with your exercise. So the first bit of human readable information that I'm going to replace with explicit machine readable information is the line breaks. The line breaks in an edition are represented by starting a new line. This is where a new line in the inscription starts, a new line in the page starts. Because new lines aren't necessarily meaningful in XML, they're never meaningful in XML. They're not any more meaningful than a space. If I just put in a new line here, then the XML is not aware that this is a new line of the inscription. So instead, we have to put in another LB element. This one saying number 2, and we do the same thing for each line. And rather than type them in, I'm going to cheat and put in the just copy and paste them. And so we have number 2, number 3, no, I did it wrong. Number 3 and number 4 and number 5. And this 5, which was already in my text, is a line number, which is again is human readable markup that that was in the text that I'm going to therefore remove. So we no longer need the human readable markup once we've replaced it with machine readable markup. The same principle applies with these hyphens at the end of lines 2 and 3 and 4. At the end of line 2, the word that ends line 2 and the letters that begin line 3 are all one word. So we have a hyphen. We know what that means because that's the same convention that we use in print. This is a convention that's used in Leiden as well, but we're going to replace that by removing that hyphen, and instead in this line beginning, the break that begins line 3 is considered to be non-breaking. So it breaks the line, but it does not break the word. So we say break equals no, and then we remove the hyphen. And we do the same here. Break is no, and we remove that hyphen, and break no, and we remove that hyphen. So you see I'm adding XML and I'm removing Unicode characters at every step. I'm not going to do everything in these 5 lines because we are running behind because we talked too much at the beginning, but I'm just going to do the first 3 things on here, I guess. So we have square brackets around this epsilon at the beginning of that line, and you'll remember from the description of Leiden earlier that square brackets are where there is text that we're pretty sure was written on the stone originally, but is now completely lost. and the editor has had to restore it by guesswork or by intelligent supplement. The TEI equivalent of that EpiDoc uses to map from Leiden to XML is an element called supplied. So I highlight that character and I ask it to insert a element called supplied. You see already it's underlined this in red, and the top right hand corner there has the square has turned red. This is now invalid EpiDoc. Why? Have I made a mistake? Have I put in the wrong element? No, this is the correct element, but in EpiDoc, the element supplied has to have at least one attribute, because supplied could mean several different things, and without specifying this, it would be ambiguous. You'll remember from the Leiden page, or you can scroll back to the Leiden page, that the attribute in question is the attribute reason, and there are various elements available, such as lost, omitted, etc. In this case, we want to say this is lost. So once I say this is supplied reason lost, it turns green again. Okay, and the red underlining has gone away. So this represents square brackets. If I didn't say reason equals loss, it wouldn't know whether I was representing Leiden square brackets or Leiden angle brackets or some other kind of brackets, which is why this ambiguity has to be resolved in order for EpiDoc to be valid. And now, because my line is now getting a bit long, by the time I mark up this abbreviation at the end of the line, I will be going off the edge of the screen. So as I said before, that XML doesn't mind where you put in line breaks. I'm just going to start a new line here. This hasn't started a new line in the inscription. It's just started, a new line in the text file, which is arbitrary and meaningless. So if you remember when we talked about Leiden, this string of characters here, eonion, is saying that the stone has the characters epsilon, o, omega, nu, but that must stand for a longer word. We can go back to the photograph and see that if you want, possibly at the end of the first line. I guess there is aeon. There's no room for eon at the end of it. So that must be the expansion of an abbreviation. So again, if you look at the quick reference documents, you'll see that how you would encode this is that the entire word is the expansion of an abbreviation. The part that is, and you can see it's underlined in red because it's invalid because I haven't finished. The part that is on the stone is the abbreviation, and the part that is not on the stone is the expansion of that. So there's actually 3 different XML tags going on there, even though there was only 1 pair of parentheses in the Leiden. So we're putting a bit more information in the Leiden than in the EpiDoc than there is in the Leiden. I then delete those parentheses just as I deleted the square brackets and I deleted the hyphens because they're redundant now. Okay. The curly braces. This is a redundant character. No, that's not a redundant character. That must be something else. This is not using Leiden the way I understand it. I'm going to skip that. So when I said earlier things were confusing before everybody used Leiden and now everybody uses Leiden, everything's the same. That's not quite true. There are still minor variations in how people use Leiden. So I will look at that again later and try and figure out what's going on there. But in any case, I wanted actually to look at something slightly more interesting, and I said I would only mark up 3 things, so I won't. I'll do this without being a liar. This abbreviation here, Flavion. This is for those of you who don't read Greek, this is the genitive plural of the name Flavius, which is a Roman name, a Latin name, but written here in Greek. This is again an abbreviation, so the entire word is the expansion of the abbreviation. The part outside, the part that is on the stone, the part outside the brackets is the abbreviation, and the part inside the brackets is the X, the expanded, the expansion. I can delete the parentheses. So we have, what we're saying here is the stone says phi lambda, and we read that as the word Flavion by adding to it this expansion abion. So if we look at the photograph, let's confirm that that's what's actually going on here. Well, this is the part of the photograph where that is going on here. We have phi, phi, lambda, lambda, and then the next word, theo, whatever that is, theod, that's continuing on there. Well, that's not what I said, is it? This seems to be implying that the stone has phi lambda, whereas the photograph of a drawing seems to imply that it's phi, phi, lambda, lambda. Well, what's going on there? This is the same as an instance we were talking about earlier, where actually the abbreviation is duplicating both letters, which is not very common in Greek. This is normally a Latin phenomenon, but it's duplicating both letters in order to show that the word is plural. So it's not phi lambda short for Flavios, it's phi lambda short for Flavion in the plural. So what we might put here, for example, is another phi and another lambda to make that correct. However, if we do that, then when we attempt to print this in Leiden, we won't get the word Flavio, we'll get Flavio, which isn't what we want either. So we have a problem that these letters, two of these letters, one of the phis and one of the lambdas, are part of the abbreviation and they're part of the expansion, but the other two are part of the abbreviation but not part of the expansion. And so in EpiDoc we encode those with this element am, which is an abbreviation mark. This is the same attribute, the same element you would use to encode the dot, for example, in an abbreviation where dr dot means doctor, but there's not a dot in the word doctor when you expand it, right? So the dot is just an abbreviation marker. So we do the same thing with this. So we mark both the second phi and the second lambda as abbreviation markers, and the first one is just unmarked within the abbreviation. This is now a little bit hard to read. You couldn't read all this very easily, but this has marked the semantics of what we want to say about this. So I won't say much more here. I won't say any more here because we've technically run out of time. We were going at the end of this session to talk a little bit about publishing these things, how you go about publishing EpiDoc files, and I don't think we really have time to talk about that, unless you wanted to say a few words on that, Elli, just to say what it is we're not saying. And we were also going to very briefly introduce the exercise, but the exercise is on, I'll just screen share again very quickly. On the session page, which if you're following, if you've joined this through Sunoikisis or through my classes or anyone else's classes, you'll have access to this. If you're just watching this on YouTube on Spec, there is a link to this page from below the YouTube video. At the bottom of this page, there is a description of the exercise. So maybe we don't need to go through this and tell you everything in there. It's all down there. If anyone has any questions about that, do feel free to get in touch with any of us who are running these sessions. So maybe, unless Elli wanted to say a few words about publication, maybe we should stop and go to discuss.
I'll say just that there are some slides that have links to different ways to turn those rather unreadable files that are full of pointy brackets and element names into something that one might present or publish on the web, and that there are a variety of ways of doing this, all of which require some technical knowledge, although some require more than others, and that there that by looking at the slides, you'll see that one way to do it is very nice and fairly simple and can be used for single inscriptions, and that it's increasingly more complex as you want to try to publish larger collections and actually act on or search across multiple inscriptions. That's all.
And that most of the inscriptions that we've been showing you are online, and for example, the inscription we've just been marking up, both the information about and the text, is this inscription. It's actually Eospe 55 from the Northern Black Sea, which is, as you see here, published online. There's all the information about the object and the text, and there's the text that we'd started marking up earlier that I copied and pasted, and then there's translation commentary and so forth. This is actually an EpiDoc file in the background. I can even show you the EpiDoc file there. That's the EpiDoc file on the Eospe website, and it has been transformed using one of these publication tools that Elli mentioned into this HTML page, this web page for reading by humans, because no human wants to read that XML that we were showing you, right? And it has also been transformed using a slightly more complex set of scripts into a series of indexes which have been through and extracted various information that has been encoded within that and tabulated them in a more a generalized way, a large scale format. So those are the two different kinds of transformation that Elli was alluding to.
Okay, thank you very much, both Gabby and Elli. This was really useful, very nice and clear and soft landing to XML and EpiDoc, which are both widely used. Does anyone have questions at the moment? If you do, please unmute yourself.
I'd add as well that there's, if you're watching this on YouTube, if you're watching this live on YouTube, there is on the top right-hand corner of the YouTube window a chat screen where you can post and ask questions, and we'll try and notice it and answer them live. If you're watching this, any time later than 5 p.m. GMT, then that chat window won't be there, and even if it were, we wouldn't be able to see it. But if you are looking at it live, that's
yeah. I had a question for Elli. I was wondering, when you were talking about describing, for example, where the object is, like museums and all other descriptions, are there some standard vocabularies that should be used for those things, or is it EpiDoc specific or project specific, so that people would use similar vocabularies?
So, excellent question. What I did not mention is that often there are project-specific vocabularies that can be set up for example, materials or object types or genres of text, but that there are also recommended ways, for example, for locations, in addition to putting in the name, for example, Jerusalem, let's say, you might add an attribute that refers to Pleiades, which is a widely used online gazetteer of places in the ancient world, which would be a URL, which is an unambiguous bit of linked data that allows anybody to know that by following it, what place you're talking about. And for example, and so although I don't think the epigraphic community has completely closed in on standardized vocabularies for object types and things like that, certainly geography is well handled by using attributes that refer to the online gazetteer. And different projects come up with controlled vocabularies. There is an effort through the Eagle vocabularies to try to at least constrain the terminology, but it's not a clean ontology, essentially. One project I work on uses the Getty Art History Index as a way of, again, putting in a word like slab, but also pointing to a definition, which is at the end of a URL, so that you can always know that this is the kind of object that I'm talking about. And if you talk about a slab and you point to the same place in the Getty index, then we're talking about the same thing. Gabby, do you want to add to that?
No, I think that summed it up quite well. I mean, that there are vocabularies that that people are proposing for, as well as place for people, for time.
That's right.
Things like that you might link out to, but the ones that I think we most urgently need are the eagle ones that you talk about. Yeah. So objects, object type, material, text type, dating conventions, these sorts of things that the good work has been done, as you say, but I think needs to be completed.
And actually, you mentioned people. Often, I think projects or corpora will use references that may not be online. I mean, if we have a prosopography that's a printed prosopography that's specific to the domain of these inscriptions, then that probably has numbers for each person, and referring to even the identification of a person inside a printed prosopography, or prosopography would be a really good way to go. So always trying to refer to some external definition that is accepted fairly widely is really useful.
No, that's a very good point. I mean, I hope in the longer term, through the Snapdragon project,
that's right,
to come up with mechanisms for turning those, PIR L241, which is only a reference to a book, into a URI, so that it can be unambiguously used, even if the entire prosopography isn't digitized. Yeah, that would be really useful. And another thing we didn't talk about is we didn't mention bibliography, which is actually one of the parts of the where Gabby was talking about the transcription, and he had the addition div, which is a division of text. There's also a bib, a div type equals bib, where you put bibliography. And one of the very important kinds of information to put in there might be the sort of well-known, easily findable bibliographic information for something in a corpus, so CIL or AE, or one of the more standard epigraphic corpora. Yeah, that's one of the values of bibliography in an epigraphic edition, isn't it? It's not just that you cite CIL because people might want to go to CIL and see an earlier edition, although that is one reason you cite it. But in some ways, the more important reason you cite it is because CIL 3804 is the name everybody knows this inscription by, and that's a way to help people know what inscription you're talking about. It's an ID, it's a URI in a way.
Yeah.
I see people in the group chat have been trying to solve that issue of the strange curly braces in my inscription. But
yeah, I think it was a mistake for the pointy brackets addition by the editor.
Yeah, because the letter isn't there.
Yeah, I don't think it's a mistake by the editor, because I say because I encoded that text in EpiDoc, and so it can't be that someone typed the wrong bracket in there, because that was transformed from the underlying EpiDoc to the page. I think what it is that at some point that project decided to use a non-standard use of that. I will double check, and if that's true, I'm going to go back to the project leads and suggest to them that they might reconsider that decision.
I also had a brief question about the text part for EpiDoc, when that inscription was quite a messy thing, and I saw that in the edition there was quite a lot of apparatus stuff. Would it be possible also, is it very complicated to add the apparatus things there in the EpiDoc? Will it be easily visible there?
So the short answer is that it's certainly possible. It's a little bit complicated, but so is creating a traditional apparatus criticus. The only thing that's a little bit that's unusually complicated about it is that there's two different ways of doing it, and that sometimes makes people uncomfortable. That they have to decide between two different ways of doing it. But that's the two different ways are either to encode the variants in the text as you reach them, and then generate an apparatus criticus from that parallel transcription in the text. And the text only shows the chosen one, and the apparatus criticus shows the full set of variants that are in there. Or to encode the apparatus criticus externally to the thing, pointing at the text and saying that bit there that's on the fourth word on line 3 has these things that we want to say about it, variant readings or so forth. It's kind of impossible to impose one of those two ways of doing it at an EpiDoc level, because in some ways one of them, the internal parallel segmentation method, is much better, it's much cleaner, and it gives you much more power and control of your edition, but it's much harder, and not all projects will do it. So both methods have to be made available, but the decision to choose between the two has to be made basically before you start encoding your corpus. So if you're going to encode 3,000 texts, you have to have decided before you encode text number 1 which of those two methods for apparatus you're going to use. But once you've decided that, then yes, it's just a matter of encoding again the semantics of that information to say what it is. So as what you saw when I encoded that abbreviation with the 2 fees and the 2 lambdas, that I was encoding things in there that are not visible in the edition, but those could, for example, generate some apparatus. We could have an apparatus note saying on line 2, on line 5, I think it was, Flavione is written on the stone. You see phi lambda lambda, and that could be generated from that encoding. So it makes the encoding a little bit more complex, but it does give you that apparatus criticus that you're talking about.
Okay. Does anyone else have some questions or comments at this point? I think we are quite well now in the schedule. So. But if not, thank you very, very much, both Gabby and Elli, for your clear presentations. And next week, we have the second session, which is on using online linguistic tools, so dictionaries and text corpora. So welcome back then. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. See you next week.
See you.